Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we are going to be taking a look at a story that's been all over the news lately, and I've got to say it's a pretty wild one.
Yeah, you can say that again. It's one of those cases that seems like it should be open and shut, but then you start peeling back the layers and
It just keeps getting weirder and weirder, right?
exactly. We've got a bunch of articles you guys sent in about the Mica Miller case.
So Mica Miller, for those who haven't been following this story, was found dead in April of this year at a state park in North Carolina.
And the official ruling was suicide by gunshot wound?
But of course, there's a but.
Always a but.
Right.
So on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, tragic, but straightforward. But Micah's family and friends, they're not buying it. They're convinced that something else is going on. And frankly, when you look at the details, it is hard not to at least wonder.
So let's break down what we know so far. We've got Mica Miller found dead in April 2024 at this state park in North Carolina. Authorities arrive on the scene, determine it's a suicide by gunshot wound. And initially, it seems like that.
Right. But then you factor in the timing of her separation from her husband, John Paul Miller.
And this is where things start to get a little murky. John Paul Miller is a pastor.
A pastor.
Yeah.
So already you've got that element of, what's going on behind closed doors.
Right. And the fact that Mica had just filed for legal separation from him just days before her death is a pretty big red flag.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you question everything about their relationship and what might have been happening leading up to her death.
For sure. And, I'm sure investigators are thinking the same thing. They had to have looked into John Paul pretty closely, right?
Of course. But the official word from the Robeson County Sheriff's Office has been and continues to be that all evidence points to suicide. They're saying they have no reason to suspect foul play.
Okay, so we have the local authorities saying case closed, it's a suicide, but then we have the FBI.
Oh, yes, the FBI. So back in May, just a month after Micah's death, the Sheriff's Office announced that the FBI was conducting a separate investigation.
Wait, so two investigations at the same time?
Yeah, it's a little unusual, right? They called it a parallel investigation, and they were very clear that this investigation had nothing to do with Micah's death and that John Paul Miller was not a suspect in her death.
So hold on, we've got two tracks here. We have the local investigation into Micah's death, which they're saying is a clear-cut suicide. And then we have this mysterious FBI investigation that no one seems to want to talk about.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so intriguing.
So the question is, if the FBI is so sure Micah's death was a suicide, what on earth are they investigating?
Right. If it's totally unrelated, why are they even involved?
It's a good question, and it's one we're going to try to answer today. We've got all these pieces of the puzzle. The suicide ruling, the estranged husband who's a pastor, the family who's not buying the official story, and the FBI lurking in the background.
It's like a recipe for a true crime drama.
And just when you think it can't get any more complicated, it does. Because just this week, the FBI raided John Paul Miller's home.
Yeah, I saw that on the news.
Yeah.
It was a pretty big development, months after they opened their investigation.
So his lawyer confirmed the raid happened, but he downplayed it, saying he hopes this is the end of it.
Well, if it was nothing, why the raid at all?
Exactly. It just seems like there's a lot more to this story than we're being told.
I think it's safe to say that there are some pieces of this puzzle that are definitely missing.
Okay, so let's put on our detective hats for a minute and try to connect some of these dots. What are some possible scenarios here? What could the FBI be investigating that's so separate from Micah's death?
Well, one possibility is that it's financial. Maybe there's some shady stuff going on at the church and John Paul is involved.
That's a good point. I mean, the FBI investigates financial crimes all the time, right?
All the time. Churches are a prime target for that kind of thing, unfortunately.
Yeah. And we don't know a ton about John Paul's life outside of being a pastor. Could it be something from his past, some skeleton in the closet that's only now coming to light?
It's definitely possible. Maybe it's something totally unrelated to Micah's death, but something that they stumbled upon during the course of their investigation.
Okay, so we've got this strange disconnect between the local authorities, who are adamant that Micah's death was a suicide, and the FBI, who are clearly investigating something but won't say what.
And the question is, are these two things completely separate, or is there some connection that we're just not seeing yet?
Because if there is a connection, that changes everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It would mean that there's a much bigger story here than we initially thought.
And that's what we're going to try to figure out today.
I'm ready to dive in.
Are you?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay, so we've been talking about the facts of the case,
Yeah.
the timeline, the official ruling, the FBI investigation. But there's another piece of this puzzle that we need to consider, and that's the human element.
Well, absolutely. We can't forget about the people who knew and loved Mica, the impact this has had on them.
Exactly. And in this case, the people closest to Mica are painting a very different picture than the official reports.
Right, they're not just grieving, they're also questioning the official narrative. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this case. Yeah, Micah's family has been very vocal about their disbelief in the suicide ruling. They're just not buying it. They're saying she would never take her own life.
And it's not just a blanket statement. They're pointing to specific things that they find unconvincing about the official story.
Like what?
Well, for example, they say that Mica was in a good place mentally. She was making plans for the future, excited about new opportunities. There were no signs of severe depression or suicidal thoughts.
So are they just in denial? I mean, grief can be a powerful thing and it can make it hard to accept a loss, especially when it's sudden and tragic like this.
It's certainly possible. Denial is a natural part of the grieving process. But we also have to consider the flip side. What if they know something we don't?
Like what?
What if Mica confided in them about something that made her fear for her safety?
You mean something related to her relationship with John Paul?
It's a chilling thought, but it would explain why they're so adamant that there's more to this story than just a simple suicide.
Yeah, and it would also raise the question of why they haven't shared that information with the authorities. If they have evidence that Mica was murdered, you'd think they'd be shouting it from the rooftops.
Unless they're afraid, maybe they saw something or heard something that makes them fear for their own safety if they speak out.
Or maybe they're trying to protect someone else. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, especially in situations like this.
It's a tangled web, for sure.
Okay.
We have the official suicide ruling, the family pushing back, and the FBI investigation looming over it all. It's hard to know what to believe.
So we keep coming back to this question. Are these all separate events, or is there a thread that connects them all?
And if there is a connection, what does that mean? What if Mica knew something about John Paul that made her fear for her safety? Maybe that's why she filed for separation.
And maybe that's what the FBI is actually investigating.
It's a plausible theory, and it would make sense of why the FBI has been so tight-lipped about their investigation. They wouldn't want to tip him off if they think he's involved in something criminal.
But then why not just say that? Why not say, hey, we're investigating something else, but we want to assure everyone that we've thoroughly investigated Mica's death and stand by the suicide ruling? Why all the secrecy?
Well, it could be a strategic move. Like we said, they might not want to alert John Paul to what they're doing. Or it could be that they genuinely believe there's no connection, but they're dealing with something sensitive that they can't disclose to the public.
So we're left with more questions than answers. And in the meantime, this case is getting a ton of public attention.
Oh yeah, it's all over the news. Social media is buzzing with theories and speculation. It's like a real-life true crime drama unfolding in front of us.
And that public attention can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you want the pressure to be on the authorities to conduct a thorough investigation, but on the other hand, you don't want that pressure to influence the outcome.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it highlights just how difficult it can be to find the truth when you have so many competing narratives and layers of complexity.
We've talked about the official narrative, the family's perspective, and the FBI investigation, but it feels like we're still missing something crucial.
Yeah, me too. We have all these pieces of the puzzle, but they don't quite fit together yet. There's a missing link somewhere.
Maybe it's something we haven't even considered yet. Maybe there's a piece of information out there that would completely change our understanding of this case.
Or maybe it's something that's right in front of us, but we're just not seeing it yet.
I guess we'll have to keep digging and see what we can uncover. All right, so we've been talking about this Mica Miller case. And honestly, I'm not sure I've ever seen a case quite like this one.
It is pretty unique, isn't it? I mean, you've got all these different perspectives, the official ruling, the family suspicions, the FBI investigation, and they all seem to be pointing in different directions.
Right, and it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, you know? What does this case tell us about how investigations work and the challenges of finding the truth when you have all these conflicting narratives?
Well, I think one thing it definitely highlights is just how much pressure there is on law enforcement, especially in a case that's gotten this much public attention. You've got the media, the social media speculation, and of course the family who is just desperate for answers.
Yeah, and that pressure can really impact the way an investigation unfolds. You know, sometimes it leads to breakthroughs, but sometimes it can also lead to tunnel vision.
Right. Are investigators so focused on proving their initial hypothesis that they're overlooking other possibilities? Or even worse, are they letting public opinion sway their judgment?
It's a valid concern, and it makes me think about confirmation bias, you know, that tendency we all have to look for information that confirms what we already believe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all do it to some extent, right?
Yeah.
We want to be right, and it can be hard to admit when we're wrong. especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as a death investigation.
But that's exactly why it's so important to have outside perspectives and to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
And that's where the family's perspective becomes so crucial. They knew Mica better than anyone, and their insights can really help to challenge the official narrative.
Though it's also important to remember that their grief and their desire for justice could be coloring their perceptions as well. It's a delicate balance.
For sure. And it really highlights the need for empathy and understanding on all sides.
Okay, but let's get back to this FBI investigation. It's the elephant in the room, right? If they're so convinced that Micah's death was a suicide, why are they still digging around months later?
It's a good question. And the lack of transparency from the FBI isn't helping matters.
Yeah.
If they want to maintain public trust, they need to be more upfront about what they're doing,
Well,
even if they can't reveal all the details.
right, because the longer they stay silent, the more people are going to assume they're hiding something.
Exactly. And that just fuels more speculation and distrust.
So where does that leave us? What would it actually take at this point to change the official narrative surrounding Micah's death?
Well, it would likely require some pretty compelling new evidence. Something that directly contradicts the evidence that supports the suicide ruling.
Like a witness coming forward or some new piece of physical evidence.
Exactly. Something that forces investigators to reevaluate their assumptions.
And that could potentially come from the FBI investigation, right? Even if they're claiming it's unrelated to Micah's death.
It's possible. Sometimes those unexpected connections emerge from seemingly separate investigations.
But we also have to be realistic. There's a chance that the FBI might not find anything at all. They could wrap up their investigation without uncovering any new information that's relevant to Micah's death.
That's true. And if that happens, we may never know for sure what happened to Mica.
And that's a tough pill to swallow, especially for her family and friends who are just looking for closure.
It is a difficult situation,
Yeah.
and it really underscores the fact that sometimes, even with the best intentions and the most thorough investigation, the truth can remain elusive.
Well said. And I think it's important for us to remember that behind the headlines and the legal proceedings are real people whose lives have been impacted by this tragedy.
Absolutely. We can't forget about the human cost to this case.
So to our listeners out there, as you continue to follow this story, I encourage you to keep Mica and her loved ones in your thoughts. Be wary of jumping to conclusions, and remember that the search for truth can be a long and winding road. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with another perplexing case.